All right, something weird is happening in cEDH, and I want to talk about it. Years ago, there was a deck that was fairly popular on the scene, had modest tournament results. This was Rog Ishi, which its goal was basically to use the multiplayer scaling of Ishi, getting +1/+1 counters for when your opponents cast spells, and then use Jeska's ability to triple that damage to be able to take out opponents quite rapidly. But the weird thing that's happened is that this deck has made a resurgence, kind of. Ishi is back, but now partnered with Rograkh. So let's discuss this new approach to an old strategy, how it's continuing cEDH's kind of trajectory towards draws instead of wins, and also what it might mean for cEDH going forward.
Distraction makers.
The new iteration of Rog Ishi has won 3 major tournaments in the last month. One was over 120 players, another was over 80, and the third one was over 60. Although still sort of a small sample size, based on that kind of player count, we can give a little bit more weight to the data that this deck is actually having an impact on the metagame. This one's main focus really is using Rograkh as an early mana source. This is the typical play pattern for Rograkh, and we've kind of been seeing him show up in a lot of different strategies lately. We see Rograkh and Silas, which is sort of your traditional turbo-focused strategy. We see Rog Thrasios, which uses Rograkh to turn on Gaia's Cradle as early as turn 1. Now, Rog Ishi. And all of these decks are using Rog for a very similar reason, and it's that Rograkh provides mana really early in the game. It also turns on some early interaction spells with the interaction suite that cares if you have a commander in play, and if you do, those spells are free. These are things like Deflecting Swat and Fierce Guardianship. But mostly this deck uses Rograkh for the mana, and it's in service of getting a Rhystic Study into play as quickly as possible so that you can establish your economy engine. We'll sort of come back to how this fits into the strategy circle a little bit later. So you can get your economy online as quickly as possible before the rush turbo strategies beat you, right? They go underneath you before you can establish your draw engine to be able to draw into the interaction that you need to stop them. So in some ways, this is kind of a similar play pattern to the decks that try to turbo out a win attempt early, except this one is not attempting to turbo out a win. You're just attempting to turbo out a Rhystic Study to make sure that you have an engine online to draw to your interaction before the turbo players can beat you. But why is this deck using Ishi? Honestly, Ishi is probably just here mostly for the colors. Obviously, blue is an extremely powerful color in cEDH. Not exactly a requirement, but if your plan is to have any kind of longevity to your game plan, it basically requires you to have blue, because counter spells act as not only a way to stop your opponents from winning, but a way for you to stop them from stopping you. This is in contrast to just regular removal spells that would destroy a creature once it's in play. That's only able to stop your opponent. Doesn't really, in most cases, stop them from stopping you. The other thing that's been uncovered, I guess, relatively recently is the power of silence effects. Not only as ways for you to protect your own win conditions, but ways for you to stop early win attempts from your opponent to kind of interrupt their ability to play the spells they would need to win the game. Silence has been a pretty popular card for quite a while in cEDH, but Orum's Chant has started to see more prominence in the meta. And so Ishi brings blue and white to this deck so that you get probably what is the best interaction cards in cEDH, generally speaking. So let's roll it even further back and just discuss what we're kind of seeing emerge, because we've seen this strategy pattern play out in not only before in Magic, but in other strategy games generally. And this is connecting us back to what is known as the strategy circle. But the strategy circle is basically the way that you can spend your resources in a resource management game. The 3 points, the sort of 3 extremes on the strategy circle are rush, economy, and defense. Rush is you spending your resources to attempt to win the game now. Economy is spending your resources as sort of an investment to get more resources later. And defense is using your resources to stop your opponent, generally speaking. Sometimes it's you spending your resources to stop your opponent from stopping you, but that's usually not the sort of traditional way that defense is seen, although it does happen in other games besides Magic. But this is really why counterspells are the most, like, the best interaction, the best defensive spells in Magic. cEDH had this metagame where a lot of the decks tried to sort of be able to do all parts of the strategy circle. I think we can point to kind of Timna Crom Blue Farm as the epitome of trying to make sure you can dip your toe in all of these areas to move between them in the game to give yourself kind of the best chance to win in any given situation. Blue Farm has been tuned in different directions where sometimes it was focused more on longer games and more in that economy and defense area, and sometimes it's focused more on the rush category of things. But generally speaking, they're not really foregoing any of these strategies in order to get an extreme payoff in one of them to kind of attack the metagame as it stands. The way that this sort of circle works is that rush strategies beat economy strategies. And the reason why that is because they're spending their resources heavily over-investing in their attempt to win the game as quickly as possible because they want to stop their opponent before their opponent can get the payoffs from the investments into those into the economy side of the circle. And another game that we see this in and can compare it to easily is StarCraft, where if you're familiar with the Zergling rush, this is like exactly what that strategy is attempting to do. If your rush is stopped, you will run out of steam as you lose those kind of expensive units early in the game, and your opponent is able to keep their economy online and overwhelm you quite quickly. In order for you to sort of fend off that rush strategy, you end up needing to shift where you're investing your resources from your economy into defense. Each different faction in StarCraft has sort of different ways to do this, but if you don't shift away from investing your economy when your opponent has moved into rush, they'll just overwhelm you and win. But if you understand how to identify what your opponent is doing and then switch to defense, you can fight this stuff off fairly easily. And that's kind of like a sort of second level heuristic in StarCraft, where there's kind of this litmus test, which is can you defend against early rush strategies to prolong the game to the point where then you could have like a real game of StarCraft. When we look at Magic, the way that this ends up playing out is rush strategies and cEDH are attempting to do this exact thing, right? They're attempting to stop their opponent from getting any of the payoffs for their economy engines by rushing to an early win attempt, undercutting what they're doing, making sure they don't get any of those payoffs so that they can't draw into their interaction, their defensive abilities, build up to their ability to win the game. cEDH in particular is subject to this as kind of a ratcheting problem where it can create kind of a positive feedback loop that means that players want to just try to win faster and faster and faster. I think this really has to do with the fact that defense is particularly disadvantaged in cEDH because of the 4-player setup. If you are put into position where you are the one stopping the rush player from winning, you're using your resources as a defense, but your other opponents, the other 2 opponents that are sort of not involved in that exchange, get to benefit from that interaction where they don't have to take time away from investing in their economy to move to defense because you did it for them and stopped that player from winning. And that kind of table dynamic is really what plays out at the politics level in cEDH, where if you are put into that weaker position to defend against this other player, you want to try to extract some kind of value from the table for like political favors, right? You can say, well, I can counter this and I will use my interaction to stop this person from winning. But if I do, I expect that you're either not going to win on your next turn or that you'll return the favor or I don't know, something, right? The politics side of this, I think, it's hard to measure. So understanding the sort of systemic forces that are at play, I think are important for understanding the table dynamics better. The cEDH decks have tended to stay in this sort of ability to move throughout all of the pieces of the strategy circle, not quite in equal measure, but keeping them all as part of the game plan, where Rog Ishi has moved into more of a specialized role. And we've seen this play out in early Magic. The earliest we saw this was with sort of these 2 schools of thought. There was sort of the school of thought of beat my opponent as quickly as possible, and that is ultimately the deck Sly, which eventually sort of becomes red deck wins. And then we have the complete opposite side of the spectrum, which is what we in Magic call a control strategy, which was the deck. It was just a deck called the deck. They thought it was that good, right? It was like, this deck is incredible. It's impossible to beat. It's the only deck that we will ever need. It is the deck. And this strategy was basically play as few ways to win the game as possible and as many ways to stop your opponent as you can and just keep them from being able to win the game, and then you win the game through inevitability. But like I said, we hadn't really seen cEDH move into that much of a specialized role except for in the rush category. So it makes a bit of sense that if rush is the thing that everybody is doing, what do you do in order to counter that strategy. And if we reference the strategy circle, we can see that, well, defense is the thing that beats rush. Theoretically, I should be able to move more into the defense category, which is counterspells, removal, those sort of things to stop your opponent from winning, so that you can weather the storm and then win through inevitability. So we think we should move to defense. But the system dynamics of Commander make that pretty difficult when you have 3 opponents. So in order for you to really have a defensive strategy that would be successful, you need to be able to stop 3 other opponents from winning the game, right? And this is where defense strategies generally become more difficult. And often players have relied on stacks strategies in order to try to do that, because they're more like persistent defense, right? They're things that stick around and keep your opponents from being able to win. The problem with stacks has always been that there will inevitably be an opponent that can slip through the cracks and win anyway. Or you might even be advantaging them maybe more than yourself if their deck, for whatever reason, is well suited to operate with under the parameters of the stacks pieces that you've put into play. So counterspells have always been the more preferred way to execute a defense strategy. But when we get to Rog Ishi, the way that they are doing this is basically saying, I'm going to play as much interaction as possible, sort of like the deck, where the deck is going to specialize into that role of being a defensive deck, where previously things like Blue Farm might play like 14 on the high end counterspells. This is playing like 20, right? It's playing as many as they can fit into the deck that are playable in the format. You're seeing a lot of unique choices like Disrupting Shoal and Commandeer, and these cards that you would only see in a deck that is specially built to execute this particular strategy. If you're just dipping your toes into defense, you're not going to be playing a lot of this stuff. The only real reason I think that this strategy can succeed in cEDH is because of Rhystic Study. If Rhystic Study wasn't here as this sort of card draw economy engine that scales with the table, they would have a really hard time having enough card advantage and to make these sort of what should be a 1-for-1 trade, which is I'm countering your thing, I'm using one of my cards to do that, but their 2 other opponents are at the table, are basically up. They're +1 in that instance because you're down 1, your opponent's down 1, they're still at 0. Because of this sort of defensive weakness in cEDH, it has been difficult to get the meta to turn over from Rush. Rush seems to be the equilibrium point, and the extremes that you have to go to be able to sort of beat Rush in the defensive category to make up for this card disadvantage is a difficult hurdle to overcome. What this then does, because this deck has specialized so much, it makes itself vulnerable to strategies, basically to economy strategies, which are decks that basically want to win through inevitability. In something like StarCraft, the paramount economy strategy is battle cruisers, right? This is where that style of play gets its name from. It's that you are investing in your economy and attempting to get to the most expensive units as quickly as possible so that you will inevitably win because you have much more powerful threats than your opponent does, and you can continue to produce them because your economy is set up to do so. So this Rog Ishi deck probably has some amount of susceptibility to decks that are trying to win through overwhelming your opponent with ways that you would win the game that overwhelm their defenses. Tayum, it might be a decent strategy to kind of attack this meta. They also have a lot of interaction that is not all that susceptible to counter spells or silence effects. And Semi-Blue is the other strategy, at least that we've kind of seen, hasn't really seen that much success. But this, if Rog Ishi sort of becomes the meta, these games are going long and there's a lot of interaction. Basically, Rog Ishi can end up in this position where it's stopping the rush decks, which would be the ones that would be beating the economy strategies. And those economy strategies can now beat Rog Ishi. That's ultimately what we kind of want, though, in a metagame, right? We want this sort of strategy turnover where players are playing the metagame. They're looking ahead at what has been popular, where the meta might go, and then they're choosing a strategy based on that sort of metagame information and choosing a deck that might be better positioned on any given weekend to try to give themselves an edge, rather than just settling with, well, this is a deck that can kind of do everything, and I'm going to stick in that category, and that way I can cover all my bases, we could enter a situation where that just ends up not being good enough anymore, which I think is kind of what we've already seen with the rush decks sort of being the thing that has overtaken those sort of mid-range do everything kind of piles. So there's a couple other things I want to touch on with the Rog Ishi specifically, and it's how this deck wins the game. And this deck really wants to push the game to go long, which is particularly problematic in cEDH. We've had in the past those games that last 11 hours, and this was the play pattern that ended up kind of leading to that outcome. Some tournament organizers have basically stepped in and taken some pretty drastic measures in order to try to prevent an 11-hour game from happening, where they have sort of implemented time limits to the elimination rounds, which traditionally speaking in a Magic tournament is not something that you would want to do. In those elimination rounds, you don't really want to have a time limit because you don't want those games to end in a draw, right? You need people to win to move up the brackets to inevitably win the tournament. It's a pretty drastic kind of unfair measure that creates some really strange incentives for people sitting at the table that are in the highest seat at the table. And it advantages decks that want to try to extend the game into draws. So that might be part of what's happening with why this deck is performing as well as it is. Okay, so we've kind of discussed what's going on. We've discussed some of the issues that are arising because of this deck's play patterns. So let's talk about maybe some solutions. I don't think we're really necessarily in needing change territory, but we do need to keep a very close eye on this problematic Rhystic Study play, right? Where the games are ending up in stalemates that can go on for 11 hours if you don't have some kind of imposed time limit on those elimination rounds. So one thing that could happen is that cEDH tournaments could change their incentives for draws. Japanese cEDH basically treats a draw as a loss. They have like a different kind of point system that they use that it's kind of complicated, but basically it just means that just think of it as like a loss and a draw are effectively the same thing in their metagame. And so players are heavily incentivized to try to win the game because obviously if you're not playing for a draw, if it doesn't give you any kind of benefit, we're in, sort of Western cEDH, draws are worth a point, wins are worth more points, but draws are still better than a loss. So the incentive is to build a deck that can at least draw and hopefully win rather than a deck that could win or lose. The other thing that might be worth discussing is Rhystic Study. And if Rhystic Study should be on the chopping block, I think a couple issues here. One is the sort of commander format management really has not acknowledged cEDH much, if at all. There was like one ban they did for the card Flash. That was the only sort of bone that they ever threw to cEDH. That was before Wizards took over the format, so it's hard to know if Wizards has the same kind of approach and the commander format panel has the same ideas around cEDH. But I think generally speaking, casual players don't really have nearly as big of a problem with Rhystic Study as what cEDH players do. I don't really think that banning Rhystic Study is going to be something that happens unless it's kind of a banned specifically in cEDH kind of thing. The other thing that I think we should keep an eye on is the fact that Rograkh seems to be emerging as kind of the best commander in cEDH, mostly because I think players are finding out that having access to mana and these free interaction spells early is really important in sort of this turbo-centric meta, so that if you're trying to come up with a strategy, you're going to have to potentially work around the fact that Rograkh has to be one of your partner commanders. So that's going to limit the sort of pool of possible strategies considerably. This does also make me wonder if part of like the mana cards that were banned before Wizards of the Coast took over the format, Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, and Dockside, if this is part of what they were doing without us really noticing it, that they were standing sort of in place of needing to play Rograkh as one of your commanders in order to have access to enough mana to get your sort of economy game plan going. Obviously, Rograkh is kind of cutting in both ways. It's giving turbo strategies that boost, but also now it seems to be giving kind of any sort of segment on the strategy circle that boost. It's possible we can end up in a meta that is turbo is Rogsai, economy is Rograkh Thrasios, and defense is Rog Ishi. And all of the sort of strategies that would be making up the metagame involve Rograkh, so that you can accelerate those things out in a way to make sure you could even have an impact on the game. The last thing that we can do is kind of wait to see how the meta shifts. I did bring up that theoretically, if we are getting this sort of hyper specialization of decks, they have weaknesses that can turn over the meta. The weaknesses here would be focusing on an economy strategy, which would be something that is, the decks that just come to mind are Tayum and Semi-Blue, because they are both focused on overwhelming your opponents with sort of like threats from every direction as much as possible, as often as possible, to overwhelm your opponent's defenses to win the game, and also focusing on your own economy so that you can get to that point, right? You're playing basically no defense or interaction at all. You're just focused on how do I ramp out to my battle cruisers as quickly as possible. I don't know Tayum's play patterns that well, and I think it operates on a bit different axis, but I would still put it in the economy side of the strategy circle. It's really interesting to see cEDH evolve in this way so that we're starting to see those sort of hyper-specialized decks having success in the metagame. I think only time will tell whether or not this gets us back to that similar kind of stalemate meta that resulted in that 11-hour game or not, but I'm curious to see how things unfold. Hopefully we get that meta turnover. Like and subscribe to the channel if you like what we're doing here. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.